My name is Alara Quinn, 34 years old. The first snowfall of December drifted past my window like static, but Louisville still hummed, sirens far off, a train sighing somewhere beyond the river, and the faint buzz of the fluorescents in my two-room office that had started flickering again. I was alone at my desk, hunched over a spreadsheet that looked more like a heartbeat than numbers, when my phone lit up with Mom. I stared at it for 2 rings too long, then answered anyway. Alara, she said, the vowels pressed thin. In our family, vowels only relaxed for people who mattered. We're finalizing the guest list for Christmas dinner. Senators, CEOs, people who've actually made it. Your father and I think it's best you sit this year out. The cursor blinked on my screen. I could see my latest efficiency simulations, black bars and tiny triumphs, waiting for someone to believe in them. Best, I repeated, keeping my voice even. For who? For you, she said, softening in the precise way she used on nervous donors. You hate performing. It would be uncomfortable for you, darling. A door opened in the background. I could hear my father's voice, low, decisive, before he took the phone. Focus on proving yourself first, he said, like I'd asked for advice and he was graciously granting it. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was. He never did when the stakes were his image. Something tightened under my ribs, a familiar heat. I tapped my pen once against the desk, a tiny metronome keeping time with my pulse. Proving what? I asked. That what you're doing is more than a project, he said, and I could picture him walking into their kitchen, the slate counters, the stainless steel. The kind of guests we're hosting, they expect substance. The word landed like a neat diagnosis. Substance. As if it were a suit you could buy and wear to dinner. Right, I said. So no seat for the unsubstantial. He missed the irony, or ignored it. We'll see you when you've got something real. The line went quiet except for his breath. Years of Sunday dinners rose up, crystal glasses and severed eye contact, Justin's latest billboard, Heather's latest fund, my mother's bylines, the neat slice of Dad's steak as he told me to be more like the children who already belonged. I thought of the brochures Mom had left on my bed. Law school, journalism, each futures she understood. Solar was not a life, it was an eccentricity. Understood, I said, and made sure he could hear how steady I was. Have a good dinner. I hung up before he could reply. The office felt smaller suddenly. The whir of the space heater, the fiberboard desk scarred by old coffee rings, a coil of wire spilling from a cardboard box. I stared at the simulations again. The latest run lifted our output by a fraction. Tiny, imperfect, but a fraction closer. My reflection in the monitor looked tired and stubborn and familiar. My company, our company, was called SolarWave because I wanted to build something that rolled forward regardless of who stood in its way. Not glamorous, not a headline, but if you let the numbers speak, the story was there. A redesign that cut thermal loss, a new ceramic for heat sinks that refused to warp, a control algorithm that learned like a patient child. None of that belonged to Christmas dinners. It didn't need to. Across the room, a string of cheap holiday lights I'd taped to the window with electrical tape sputtered faintly, their colors dulled by the office dust. The lights in my parents' dining room would be warm and perfect and paid for by people who shook my father's hand and called my mother extraordinary. In their world, status was a language, and I'd been given the wrong dictionary. I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting the chair creak. My mind walked backward. To me at 16, sketching panels in the margins of notebooks, while Heather practiced her pitch voice. To me at 20, packing boxes after dropping out because I needed more time in labs than in lecture halls. To me at 23, scalding my fingers on a prototype in a rented garage that smelled like gasoline and cold, shouting yes when tiny LEDs finally blinked like stars. Every year, my family mistook my quiet for emptiness. They never learned that the loudest work happens where no one is watching. A gust of wind slapped the window. I stood, crossed to the whiteboard, and uncapped a marker. No speeches tonight. No posture. Just math. The last thermal test showed drift at high load, the kind of flaw that had humiliated us once before. We hadn't forgotten what overheating felt like. A client's email. The stench of burnt polymer, a week where I'd eaten cereal for dinner and told Matthew we were done. He'd only laughed and handed me a wrench. We're not done, he'd said. We just found the map. Substance, I said aloud to the empty room, and wrote it in the corner of the board like a dare. Under it, I listed what a senator would recognize if a senator ever bothered to look. Output gains, cost per watt, lifetime degradation curves. Not an RSVP, but a ledger. Not applause, but proof. My phone buzzed on the desk. A message from Matthew. Got the replacement heat sink samples. Swing by in the morning? Another from Denise, our investor, time-stamped earlier. Board wants clarity on Q1 pipeline. Send me a one-pager by Friday. I typed back to Matthew. Early. Bring coffee, and to Denise. Draft tonight. You'll have it in the morning. My hands were already moving faster than my thoughts. The call with my parents sharpened everything. If I couldn't have a seat at their table, I would build a table so large their house might fit on it like a coaster. I opened a new document and started the one-pager, letting the sentences march. The big picture was simple. We had a design on the cusp, a set of conversations with a regional utility that could turn into more than a pilot if we delivered a clean fix, and a data story strong enough to hold in any room. I didn't write the name. I didn't jinx what was still tender. But even typing regional utility made something in me sit up straighter. The next week mattered. The next week could change everything. Outside, the snow thickened. Somewhere, my family's dining room would be loud and bright. Heather would be sitting with her ankles crossed just so, explaining a fund structure while men nodded. Justin would drift in late and be forgiven immediately. My mother would tilt her head and make an observation that landed like authority. My father would work the room. Someone would say my name, and someone else would say, "Oh, the solar one?" And everyone would smile like that was endearing. I clicked save and watched the little bar fill up, a tiny progress meter that felt like oxygen. The heater coughed once, then settled. I poured the last of the burnt coffee into a mug and grimaced at the taste, then drank anyway. When you've spent years eating the consequences of your choices, bitterness stops scaring you. My phone lit again. This time, a photo from Matthew. The new heat sink spread across a workbench like dull silver petals, his thumb in the corner of the frame. A joke caption, "Shiny things, for dragons." I laughed despite myself. There are people who see you as an equation, and there are people who see you as a solution. In rooms where I was a question mark, Matthew had been a period. Denise, too, in her own way. Clipped emails and impossible deadlines, and the one time she'd said, "I've seen worse odds win." It had felt like a benediction. I turned off the string lights, and the office slipped into softer dark. In the window, my reflection looked back. Tired, yes, but not small. On the whiteboard, substance glowed faintly in dry erase ghosting. On my desk, the one-pager waited, half-born. I pressed my palm against the cool glass and let the cold wake me fully. "Not ready," I whispered, borrowing their words and reshaping them. "Not ready for their table, ready for mine." If you had been there, if you had stood in that quiet with me, you might have heard what I heard then. Not the train, not the heater, not the echo of their approval withheld. I heard a hinge, a small one, the sound of something beginning to turn. I sat again and typed the final lines of the one-pager, naming the targets without naming them, laying out the lift, the timeline, the risks. When I was done, I sent it to Denise and texted Matthew. "Tomorrow we push, bring the good coffee." Then I closed the laptop and stood, letting the chair scrape back, letting the scrape say what I did not say aloud. I will not beg to be seated. I will build the room. The snow outside thickened to a veil. Somewhere across town, my family lifted their glasses. In the reflection, I lifted my chin. The numbers on my screen had already started to change the way I breathed. And though I wouldn't admit it yet, even to myself, I knew. In the quiet, something enormous had begun to move in my favor. If you'd asked me when the cracks in the Parker family started to show, I wouldn't point to that Christmas call. I'd go back years earlier to the dinner table, our family's chosen arena. The dining room was always polished to intimidation. Crystal glasses that caught the chandelier light like spotlights, linen napkins folded into stiff crowns, and food plated like exhibits. Yet every Sunday, no matter how carefully Mom staged the table, I knew where the arrows would land. "Justin closed another case this week," Dad would announce, not bothering to hide the pride that sharpened his voice. My brother, sharp suit, easy grin, would shrug modestly, as though billboards featuring his face hadn't just gone up across Louisville. Heather, 2 years younger than me, but already parading around as a fund manager, would casually mention, "We signed off on a new portfolio, 8 figures, projected double-digit growth." She always let the numbers linger, like perfume. Then, like clockwork, the spotlight would turn. "And you, Alara?" Mom would say, her fork suspended, eyes cool. "Still playing with those sketches?" "They're not sketches," I'd mutter, my hand tightening on the stem of my glass. "They're not a career either," Heather would fire back, her smirk practiced. Dad didn't even look up. He'd carve his steak, red juices bleeding across the porcelain, and say, "Why can't you be more like Justin?" He never asked why I was myself. I learned to chew in silence, to keep my eyes on my plate while my chest burned. The dinners were less about food, more about hierarchy, and I was the footnote on their menu. But not to everyone. When I escaped upstairs, notebook tucked under my arm, I'd sometimes hear a knock that was softer than theirs. Harold Carter, my grandfather, my mother's father, would shuffle in with his worn cardigan and eyes that still glowed with mischief despite his failing health. "Show me," he'd say, settling beside me as though the equations and solar cell diagrams in my notebook were treasures. "It won't make sense," I'd warn him. "Try me." So I did. I explained angles of sunlight, storage efficiency, the promise of panels that could outlast storms. He'd nod, not because he understood every formula, but because he understood me. "You've got something special, Alara," he'd whisper. "Don't let them dim your light." At 17, he gave me a book so battered, its spine cracked when I opened it. Renewable Energy Pathways. Dog-eared pages, notes scribbled in his tidy engineer's hand. Inside the cover, he'd written, "This world needs people like you. Keep going." That night, after another dinner where Dad dismissed my fantasies and Heather rolled her eyes, I clutched that book like a shield. But shields don't always hold. At 18, during one of the worst dinners I remember, Dad's voice cut sharper than ever. "You're wasting your potential. You could be in law school by now." "Law school?" I snapped, for once not swallowing the words. "That's your dream, not mine." "Don't raise your voice," Mom warned, her tone carrying the weight of an entire newsroom's authority. Heather smirked. "Maybe if you tried harder, you'd actually matter." Something broke. My chair scraped against the hardwood as I shoved back and stood. "I'm done." Mom's lips thinned. Justin didn't even look up from his phone. Dad's silence was worse than anger. I walked out that night, Harold's book pressed under my arm, promising myself I'd prove them wrong. Not for them, but for me. School didn't offer refuge either. Teachers praised my ideas, but docked me for late homework when I'd spent nights tinkering with circuit boards instead of memorizing formulas. Classmates nicknamed me the Dreamer, half in jest, half in pity. But Harold's voice lingered. "They don't get to define you." It was the lifeline I clung to when my mother slipped a law school brochure into my bag at 16, when Dad ignored my acceptance letter to the engineering program at the University of Louisville, when Heather scoffed at my designs taped to the wall of my dorm room. Still, by the time I turned 19, the pressure felt like a vice. I'd sit in lecture halls, my notebooks cluttered with sketches of solar grids instead of class notes, and wonder if I was already failing their prophecy of failure. Harold's book stayed on my desk, its corners bent from being thumbed too often. On nights when I almost believed my family's voices that I was reckless, unrealistic, nothing but a girl scribbling fantasies, I'd open to the first page and see his note, "Keep going." That note would become the thread I followed into the dark. By the time I turned 20, the choice was no longer avoidable. I'd spent 2 years forcing myself through engineering lectures, but every time a professor droned on about textbook theory, my pen drifted to the margins, sketching panel layouts, circuits, storage systems. My notebooks were crammed with ideas no syllabus had room for. One spring afternoon, I walked into the registrar's office with trembling hands and filled out the withdrawal form. The pen scratched across the paper like a scream no one else could hear. When I handed it over, the clerk didn't even look at me, just stamped it and slid it into a pile. My life, reduced to another piece of bureaucracy. The fallout at home was nuclear. Dad called me into the living room that weekend, his face a storm. "You're throwing your life away on a pipe dream," he shouted, the veins in his neck straining. His coffee mug hit the table hard enough to rattle the silver-frame photos of Justin's graduation and Heather's first business award. Mom stood behind him, arms folded like she was about to write my obituary. This isn't just reckless, Alara. It's delusional. You think you're smarter than everyone else? You'll come crawling back when the world chews you up. Justin, in from his clinic, barely looked up from his phone. Good luck with that, he muttered, like I was a patient he'd already pronounced beyond saving. Heather didn't bother with subtlety. You're embarrassing us. Her voice dripped with disdain, like she was scrubbing away a stain she'd rather not admit belonged to her. Their verdict was unanimous. No tuition, no allowance, no safety net. I was on my own. That night, I packed a duffel bag and walked out with a knot in my throat, Harold's battered book pressed against my ribs like a compass. My new home was a studio apartment with peeling paint, a leaky faucet, and windows that rattled when trucks rolled by. Rent drained what little savings I had, and groceries became a rotation of ramen, cereal, and whatever diner leftovers I could sneak home after my shift. The loneliness was crushing. My classmates were posting about internships and frat parties, while I was working nights pouring coffee for truckers, inhaling the smell of burnt bacon and counting quarters in the dark. But then, Harold. A week after I left campus, the phone rang. His voice was weaker than I remembered, but steady. I believe in you, Alara, he said. Days later, an envelope arrived in the mail. Inside, a check for $10,000, his life savings. On the memo line, in shaky script, he'd written, "Build something real." I cried so hard the ink blurred. A month later, Harold was gone. I stood at his funeral, clutching the book he'd given me, his last words echoing in my chest. Keep going. With his money, I bought a used laptop, software, a stack of secondhand engineering manuals, and a handful of parts. SolarWave was born not in a gleaming lab, but in a drafty apartment that smelled like mildew. Days were spent in the library, teaching myself from textbooks. Nights were spent at the diner, refilling coffee cups, smiling at strangers while my feet ached. At home, I soldered wires until my fingers blistered, sketching prototypes on napkins sticky with syrup. The first prototype was a disaster. Circuits fried, panels cracked. I sat on the floor, head in my hands, Dad's voice echoing, pipe dream. But each failure taught me something. Each burnt wire was data. Each crack was a map. I whispered to Harold's book, the corners bent from my grip. I'll prove it, Grandpa. I'll build something that lasts. I was 23 when Matthew Hayes slid into the booth across from me at a half-empty coffee shop in downtown Louisville. My laptop screen was a mess of circuit diagrams and half-finished simulations, surrounded by crumpled napkins covered in equations. I didn't even notice him at first, until his voice cut through the static in my head. You're the solar panel girl, right? I looked up, defensive. Too many people had said those words with a smirk, but Matthew's tone wasn't mocking. It was curious, maybe even impressed. He tapped the edge of my notebook. This design, your efficiency's low because your heat sinks are garbage, but the concept, it could work. That was the beginning. Matthew was lanky, always in a worn-out flannel and glasses that slid down his nose, but he carried an energy I hadn't seen in anyone since Harold. He'd been part of a startup once, failed spectacularly by his own admission, but that failure gave him something I didn't have, scars in all the right places. He knew what not to do, and for reasons I couldn't yet understand, he saw something worth betting on in me. We started working out of a rented garage with a leaking roof and a floor that smelled faintly of gasoline. Our equipment was scavenged, salvaged wires, secondhand soldering irons, a whiteboard rescued from a school auction. I paid the bills with diner tips and freelance coding gigs, while Matthew brought an endless supply of bad jokes and technical know-how. This is going to catch fire, I warned him once, watching sparks pop from a clunky prototype. Good, he grinned, dousing the smoke with a rag. At least we'll know it's alive. 6 months in, we had something more than a toy, a rough prototype that could generate power consistently. It wasn't pretty, but it was enough to build a pitch deck. Matthew called in a favor from a friend of his, Denise Yang, a partner at Blue Horizon Ventures. I spent nights practicing the pitch in front of a cracked mirror, my voice trembling with every run. Denise was sharp, her gaze cutting through slides like a scalpel. Your numbers are optimistic, she said flatly after an hour. I thought it was over, but then she leaned back, her eyes calculating. You've got guts. I'll put in 50,000. Don't waste it. It wasn't much, but it was oxygen. We moved from the garage into a tiny office with peeling linoleum floors, We bought better equipment, hired 2 part-time coders, and slapped the name SolarWave on our door. Our first big client was a warehouse willing to test our system. Matthew and I pulled 18-hour days, wiring panels on the roof in freezing wind, double-checking algorithms at midnight. When the system powered on, I felt my chest swell. We'd done it. But a week later, the panels overheated, circuits fried, the client pulled out. I still remember the smell of burnt polymer, the look on Matthew's face when we stood on that roof staring at failure. "We're done," I said, my voice flat, the words tasting like ashes. I thought of Dad's sneer, pipe dream. I thought of Mom's voice, delusional. I thought of Heather rolling her eyes. They were right. I was nothing but a dropout burning other people's money. But Matthew wasn't ready to let it end. He dropped the charred panel with a clatter and turned to me. "Failures are data. Now we know what not to do." I wanted to scream at him, but his eyes held steady. He wasn't mocking. He wasn't pitying. He was sure. And in that moment, when my entire world felt like smoke, I borrowed some of his certainty just to stand. We went back to the drawing board. He dug into cooling systems and voltage regulators. I recalculated energy yields, tracing every flaw in my math. Denise's emails grew shorter, sharper. Fix it fast or it's over. But she didn't pull the plug. It was grueling. Nights in the office stretched into dawn, our desks cluttered with energy drink cans and solder dust. Sometimes I'd catch Matthew asleep in his chair, marker still in his hand from the whiteboard. Sometimes he'd wake me from a nap on the floor with a fresh cup of coffee. And sometimes, when the fatigue broke down my walls, I'd admit the fear aloud. What if they're right? What if I can't do this? Matthew would just grin that crooked grin. Then we fail again, and then we fix it. That's what real looks like. For the first time since Harold, I felt like someone was in the fight with me. But the fight was only beginning. The warehouse failure should have sunk us. For weeks afterward, I couldn't stand the smell of solder. It reminded me of scorched circuits and the look in that client's eyes as he tore up our contract. But Matthew refused to let the ashes be the end. "We didn't die," he said one night as we sat on the office floor surrounded by burnt wires. "That means we pivot." Pivot. That word became our lifeline. We dug into every flaw, cooling systems, voltage regulators, faulty alloys. Nights blurred into mornings as we scribbled on whiteboards and scavenged parts from scrapped electronics. My body ran on caffeine and adrenaline, but my mind clung to the belief that if we fixed this heat problem, everything else would fall into place. And slowly it did. By our second year, we designed a new panel with ceramic-coated heat sinks and smarter control algorithms. It worked. The efficiency climbed to 20%, better than anything local competitors offered. A small brewery took a chance on us. When their electric bill dropped 30% after a month, they called us a miracle. Then came a community center, then a small factory. Word spread. Industry blogs started to mention SolarWave. Promising startup, efficiency breakthrough. For the first time, my name appeared in print for something other than family gossip. I printed one of those articles and taped it above my desk. But recognition has a dangerous side effect: hope. That December, Louisville glowed with holiday lights, and I allowed myself to believe this might be the year my family finally looked at me differently. We weren't just tinkering anymore. We had contracts, press mentions, data that could stand in any boardroom. Maybe Dad would nod with respect. Maybe Mom would ask about my work. Maybe Heather's smirk would finally crack. I called home. Mom answered. "Christmas dinner?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Her silence was short, sharp, rehearsed. "We're hosting important guests this year. Senators, CEOs, people who've made it." "I've made something," I said, the words spilling before I could stop them. "SolarWave is signing contracts. We're being written about. Dad's voice cut in, taking the receiver. "Your little project isn't there yet. Come back when you've got something real." Something real. I gripped the phone so tightly it hurt. "It is real," I whispered, but the line went dead. Heather texted later, just 2 words: catch up. Their rejection didn't shock me. It just carved deeper into the scar. But this time, instead of collapsing under it, I turned the pain into fuel. Christmas lights blinked across the city that week. Couples filled the ice rink downtown. My family's house overflowed with music, laughter, champagne toasts, and me. I was in the office, hunched over my laptop with Matthew, crunching numbers for a pitch that could change everything. Nexus Solutions, a regional energy giant, had reached out. Their director, Susan Lin, wanted to see if SolarWave could handle a grid-scale project. It was the kind of contract that could push us from local news to national spotlight. While my family dined on filet mignon and validation, I stared at spreadsheets, simulations, and pitch slides. My fingers cramped from typing, my body sore from nights on a couch in the office. Matthew slid takeout across the table, his smile crooked but steady. "We'll eat real food when we sign Nexus," he joked. I laughed, but my chest burned. My family had excluded me from their table again. So I made a promise to myself. I would build a table so large they'd one day beg for a seat. And when that day came, I'd decide whether they got one. Christmas Eve didn't feel like a holiday. It felt like a trial. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the email from Susan Lin of Nexus Solutions had landed in my inbox, blunt and terrifying. "Solid proposal, but your heat dissipation system is underdeveloped. Fix it by tonight." I sat frozen, staring at the screen. The heat issue. Our old nemesis. The ghost of every failure we thought we'd buried. If we couldn't fix it in 6 hours, the $150 million deal would evaporate like smoke. I dialed Matthew, who was halfway through Christmas dinner with his parents. "We've got 6 hours," I said, my voice thin but sharp. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he answered without hesitation, the sound of clinking dishes fading as he grabbed his coat. By 3 o'clock, the office buzzed with frantic energy. Our desks were buried under printouts, prototypes, half-drained coffee cups. Matthew sketched frantically on the whiteboard, arrows stabbing across diagrams of airflow and thermal dynamics. "We need a lighter alloy for the sinks," he muttered, pushing his glasses up his nose, "something that pulls heat faster." I recalculated yields on my laptop, numbers scrolling so fast they blurred. Every keystroke felt like a heartbeat. At 6, the heater in our cramped office gave up. The air grew cold, our breath fogging as we argued over voltage regulators. But the cold didn't matter. The fire in our work kept us moving. My hand cramped around the marker as I scribbled equations, erased them, wrote them again. "Try this," Matthew said, shoving a diagram toward me. A new design for heat dispersion, using layered fins to spread thermal load. I ran the simulation, my stomach knotted. The output climbed, 21%, 22%, then 25%. My throat tightened. "It works," I whispered, barely believing it. "Matthew, it works." By 8:30, we had a redesigned prototype and a set of numbers strong enough to silence any skeptic. I polished the slides with trembling hands, my chest aching from too much caffeine and not enough air. At 9:47 p.m., I hit send. Updated proposal attached. Here's your fix. Then I collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling, my heart refusing to slow. At 10:15, my phone buzzed. Susan Lin's name lit the screen. I swiped it open with hands that didn't feel like mine. "Your solution checks out. Nexus Solutions is awarding SolarWave a $150 million contract. Congratulations." The words blurred. I sat up too fast, the room spinning. Matthew's voice came through the speaker when I called him, hoarse with disbelief and joy. "We did it, Alara. We actually did it." He whooped so loud I had to pull the phone away from my ear. I laughed, real, unguarded laughter, tears cutting down my face. For the first time in years, Harold's voice didn't echo as a ghost. It pulsed alive inside me. Build something real. Then the local news cut in on the TV I'd left humming in the background. "Breaking news," the anchor's voice rang out. Louisville startup SolarWave has secured a record $150 million contract with Nexus Solutions, marking a milestone in renewable energy. The screen filled with our logo, my name, Alara Quinn, co-founder of SolarWave. My breath caught. The world was saying my name, not my family. Not my father slicing me down at the dinner table. Not my mother, cold and clipped. Not Heather with her smirk. The world was saying my name. I leaned forward, pressing my palms into my eyes, laughing and sobbing all at once. I had been invisible for so long that I'd almost believed them. But tonight, the lights weren't on their dinner table. They were on me. Matthew texted me a single emoji. Minutes later, Denise called. For once, her clipped investor's tone softened into something close to pride. "You've just shaken up the industry," she said. "Get ready for the storm that follows." I stared at the snow swirling outside the office window. Somewhere across town, my family was raising crystal glasses to a world where I didn't exist. They didn't know yet that everything had just changed. I whispered to the empty office, "You told me to come back when I had something real. Well, This is real. And for the first time, I didn't need their table at all. The morning after the Nexus announcement, I was running on 2 hours of sleep and too much caffeine when the receptionist buzzed my office. Alara, your family is here. For a moment, I thought she meant Matthew, or maybe Denise. But when I walked into the lobby, there they were. Dad in his polished navy suit, Mom in a tailored coat, Heather in a blazer sharp enough to cut glass. They looked like they were headed to a gala, not my startup's cramped headquarters. Alara, Dad said, striding forward with a practiced smile. We saw the news. What an achievement. He extended his hand like I was a colleague, not a daughter. Mom's voice was softer, almost convincing. We're so proud of you. Heather chimed in, eyes flicking around the office like she was appraising property. This is huge. I know investors who'd love to meet you. I can set up introductions for SolarWave's sake. There it was. Not pride, not reconciliation, opportunity. I stood rooted, my fists curling. Their words carried the weight of every dismissal, every Sunday dinner where I was invisible, every smirk, every time they told me I wasn't enough. You're proud now? I asked, my voice low but steady. Dad raised an eyebrow. He hadn't expected resistance. When I was working nights at a diner just to pay rent, where were you? I said, staring at him. When I dropped out and built prototypes that caught fire, you called me reckless. When I begged for a seat at Christmas dinner, you told me I wasn't ready. But now that my name's on TV, now that the world finally sees me, now you do too. Mom's lips tightened. Heather crossed her arms, defensive. You're being dramatic, she scoffed. We're here, aren't we? You're here because the news told you to be, I shot back. Not because you believed in me. The silence in the lobby was heavy. Behind me, Matthew leaned against the wall, arms crossed, giving me a small nod, like he'd known this moment was coming all along. Dad tried to recover, his tone dipping into warning. You're making a mistake, Alara. Family is family. You'll need us someday. I almost laughed. I needed you 10 years ago. I don't anymore. Mom reached out, her voice smoothing into diplomacy. Let's talk this over at lunch. Celebrate properly. I stepped back. I've got work to do. You know the way out. Heather muttered something under her breath, but I didn't catch it. I didn't care to. As they turned and left, Matthew walked up and handed me a cup of coffee. That was badass, he said with a crooked grin. I exhaled, my chest finally loosening. That was final. 6 months later, SolarWave was everywhere. Our panels powered half of Louisville's public buildings. The office buzzed with new hires, contracts stacked on my desk. Industry journals called us pioneers. For the first time, I wasn't the invisible one in the Parker family. I was the name they couldn't escape. Their calls went unanswered. Their texts, polite at first, then desperate, sat unread. Justin never bothered reaching out at all. Maybe he was too proud. Maybe he didn't know how. But I realized something. I didn't need them. My world was richer without their constant judgment. I had Matthew, my co-founder and anchor. I had Denise, my sharp-edged mentor. I had Diane Carter, a scientist I met at a conference whose passion for renewable tech matched my own, and whose laughter filled the empty spaces my family had left behind. And I had Harold's memory, the only one who ever saw me clearly. With SolarWave's profits, I launched the Harold Carter Scholarship Fund, $100,000 a year for young innovators in renewable energy. At the opening ceremony, I stood on stage holding Harold's battered book, the one with his note scrawled inside. Keep going. This is for dreamers who don't have a cheering section, I told the crowd, my voice steady. Diane squeezed my hand off stage, and Matthew clapped loudest from the front row. The first recipient was an 18-year-old kid with a solar battery prototype scribbled on napkins. His eyes shone the way mine once did, before the world told me to give up. Looking at him, I felt Harold smiling somewhere. My family lost me, not because I failed them, but because they never saw me. That was their burden, not mine. And for the first time, I truly believed it. I didn't need their table. I had built my own.